If you want to grow enough calories to feed yourself, what do you grow? I'm David the Good, and we're going to take a look at the answer. The farther north you go, the harder it is to grow your food. That's why with cultures like the Inuit, as an extreme example, you see pretty much a lot of meat eating and not a lot of vegetables or fruits or anything else, because there's no growing season to grow them in. But if you move a little further down out of the Arctic Circle there, you start to see more barley and grain growing. Oats in particular would be a cool season for the far north. You know, you get your oatmeal, that kind of thing. So you start to see the small grains, which are annual grains that produce in a quick period of time. You get closer down, more of a temperate climate, like most of the United States, you'll have a wider variety of crops. You get your turnips and your pumpkins and various grains. You also start to get roots like potatoes, sweet potatoes, that sort of thing. Now you get down to the tropics and there's a huge variety of staple crops and fruits that produce year-round. You have your bananas, you have breadfruit, you have that kind of thing. So what you're going to grow according to the climate is going to vary as you move further north or further south. Grains are not my favorites. If you can grow something else other than grains, grow it. Like potatoes. There's a reason that potatoes became the favorite of the Irish. It's because for the amount of work and the amount of space, there's a lot more production on calories in potatoes than in grains. And if you've ever grown grains and then had to shell them and grind them and do all the work it takes to thresh them out and get them ready to eat, it's an absolute pain in the neck. I've done it with wheat, and I've done it with barley, and I've done it with amaranth, and I don't want to do that. It's a pain in the neck how much work and space you have to set aside to get something edible. So unless you're in a very cold climate, a lot of those small grains don't really make sense unless you really want to grow your own bread and you have the space for it and you're set up to do so. Otherwise, the only grain I think that makes sense is grain corn. When I talk about corn as a staple crop, I'm not talking about sweet corn. Sweet corn is not a particularly good staple crop. It's not really a staple crop at all. It's very nice for a barbecue, but if you want to survive, you want grain corn. Grain corn is where you make your corn flour, corn bread, corn fritters, all that kind of stuff. Oh, and grits. Yeah, that's very important for the apocalypse. Corn, unlike other grains, is very easy to deal with. You harvest the ears when they're dry, and you crack off the kernels, and you're all set. I mean, you don't have to sit there and try to beat the husks off them and get pricked by little thorny awns. They call them awns, I don't know why. You don't have to deal with all that mess and then turn around and, have to then go and grind it. All you have to do is just break it off and grind it. So I really love grain corn. If you're farther north, you want to stick to flint corn varieties. Flint corns tend to have a shorter season, and there are varieties that go up into Canada, depending on where you are, and will produce corn in the short season in between frosts. Corn is a warm season crop, so if it gets cold and freezes, you're probably going to lose your corn. So flint corn for farther north. Further south, you can grow dent corn, which is the corn that is often used to make grits. Dent corn is a great big corn plant, and it makes a lot of stalk. So you can get great big plants which are very good to feed animals and to use for the compost pile, but it may take as long as another 30 days past flint corn's production. So if you have a long warm summer, go ahead and plant those dent corns. If you have a shorter summer, go with flint corns. The next staple crop I want to cover is one that has kept people alive for a long time. The Indians, the settlers, the pilgrims. We're talking winter squash and pumpkins. Not just pumpkins like the pumpkins that you would have at Halloween. Those taste terrible. They're basically bred to be ornamental. No, I'm talking like old school pumpkin varieties, like tan cheese pumpkin, those old Amish pumpkins. Those are good. Those are delicious. And winter squash, which is the same botanically as the pumpkins, things like Hubbard, Boston marrow, some of these old varieties that grow you a great big winter squash, which because of the hard and waxy skin, some of these you actually have to smack open with a hatchet or really be careful when you open with a knife because they have a very hard rind. They'll keep for months and months. There's actually a variety that I used to grow in Florida called Seminole pumpkin, named after the Seminole Indian tribe, that would keep for as long as a year on the shelf because of its hard, waxy skin. That's excellent for survival. Now, they're not as great on your carbohydrate load as something like potatoes, but they do keep for a very long time. They can be dehydrated if you open them up and dry them. Some traditional societies have done that. And you want them in your garden as a little bit of an extra calorie crop. If you have a rougher, wider area, they don't take a lot of work to grow, and they sprawl all over the place. They cover the ground, and they will give you good yields that keep for a long time, and they also have more nutrition in them. That nice bright color on the inside equals good nutrition. So definitely add your pumpkins / winter squash to the list. And this isn't your little yellow crookneck squash or your what are called summer squash that you eat at the immature stage. You're eating the mature, nice, big, hard, long-keeping pumpkins and squash. The next staple crop you probably want to consider is beans. And again, not green beans, but dry beans. Dry beans don't make sense in all situations. The good thing about them is that they produce quickly and they are high in protein, unlike most staple crops. The problem with beans is that you've got to make sure you've got some space for them, and you have to sit there and shell them. Some areas grow beans really well, and in some areas beans aren't very happy. So the chances are you can find a bean that is well adjusted to your area, find out what people have grown there traditionally, and grow that bean, and grow it as a dry bean. Some of them you can use as a green bean and then later as a dry bean when they mature. So if you want to do both, do that. Or plant varieties specifically for green beans, which are nice as a vegetable but not as a staple, and then grow other varieties to use as a dried bean. Chickpeas are another option, but they don't really produce a whole lot for the space that they take up. The next staple crop that you want to consider is the sweet potato. If you're in the south or up through the middle of the country, chances are you've got time to grow sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes come from the tropics, and they are very nutritious for you, and they don't have quite that insulin kick that white potatoes have. They're also a green vegetable. People don't think of them as a green vegetable, but you can take the leaves off of sweet potatoes and cook them just like you would cook spinach, and they're very good for you. We've been doing that for years. Sometimes we've even grown sweet potatoes just so we can harvest the leaves. So for extra nutrition, sweet potatoes gives you both the calories of the root, they give you that vitamin A and other nutrition, and they also give you a leafy green. So that is a hard working staple if you have a long enough season to grow them. They take longer than white potatoes do, so keep that in mind. Make sure you can grow sweet potatoes in your area before you commit to them heavily. But they're very easy to start and easy to grow, and they are a very good staple. For a long time, I have been posting survival plant profiles, and I decided to rank the other survival crops in terms of spuds, because potatoes are basically the very best survival root that you can grow. If your climate allows it, if you don't have problems with blight or the wrong type of soil or conditions, potatoes are fantastic. And they produce a lot of calories for a small amount of space. They keep for a long time, and they're very easy to grow. They're tolerant of so-so soil conditions. I've put them in some pretty rough ground. I mean, you've probably even seen people growing them in tires or in piles of mulch or in straw. They don't really need a lot of input for the calories they put out. So potatoes are kind of your king of staple crops if your climate allows. If you get down into the tropics, they have a hard time growing. And if you get really far north, you're probably not going to be able to grow them. But if you get too far north to grow potatoes, you're probably not going to be able to grow much of anything else, and you're going to want to learn how to bow hunt. You might think of garden beds and annual crops when you think of staples, but my next crop is actually less work and probably more nutritious than quite a few of the staples on this list. And that is tree nuts. Pecans, walnuts, hazelnuts, and chestnuts. Back before the chestnut blight took most of the chestnut trees out of North America, they were a very important staple crop to the various tribes wandering around. And chestnuts have fed humanity for a very long period of time, because once you get a chestnut tree in the ground, they will produce nuts for hundreds of years, and they don't take a whole lot of work. I planted disease-resistant varieties of chestnut, the Dunstan chestnut in particular, which has hybridized to fight against the chestnut blight, which wiped out most of the chestnut trees in North America. And you can get lots of nuts which are comparable in nutrition or comparable in carbohydrates to a grain, but they have more nutrition. So chestnuts are a fantastic one, more towards the carb end of the spectrum. And then if you want those good fats and just awesome for you nutrition, walnuts and pecans. Now this is a longer term investment, but if you plant some nuts now, in 5 or 10 years, you're going to be harvesting buckets of them, and you're not going to be working very hard for them. So there's another staple that a lot of people will overlook. My next staple crop is turnips. I've grown turnips for quite a while, and I've actually quit growing turnips. They used to be my cool season survival root, and so I would have my potatoes and sweet potatoes and cassava and other things growing during the summer months when it was warm, and then when it got to a little cooler, I would put in turnips, and we would harvest those through the winter and the early spring. But we got really tired of turnips. Now you can live on turnips if you have to, but I realized I had grown too many turnips when my wife made a turnip pie. And she said, I couldn't think of anything else to do with all these turnips, so I decided to make a pie. It was terrible, and I don't want to repeat that experience again. So turnips are they're good for you, and they have the benefit of also having really good greens. But we discovered we actually liked cooking the greens more than we liked eating the roots. There's only so many things you could do with turnips before you never want to eat another turnip again. They're good for survival, they're not so good in pies. A staple crop for pretty far north, we're talking like Minnesota, freezing Minnesota weather, is the Jerusalem artichoke. And you'll see a lot on the Jerusalem artichoke as a potential survival crop. It puts a lot of calories in the ground. It is a perennial sunflower. I love those perennial crops, and it comes back year after year if you plant a patch of it. It's actually kind of hard to get rid of if you have the right climate, but you could stick some of these little tubers in the ground in the fall, and they will sit there underneath the freezing ground and the snow and everything else, and in spring you will have these beautiful tall sunflowers, and when they die back again in fall and the frosts come, you dig up big buckets of these roots. The problem with them is they contain inulin, which your body has a hard time digesting, which leads to massive amounts of gas and stomach pain, and is a very unpleasant experience. I had a friend who had a lot of trouble with it. You know, he just doubled over. It's not fun. So I actually find that if you're going to grow Jerusalem artichokes, grow them to feed to something else that is a better food, like pigs or chickens or whatever else. Just don't eat a bunch of them yourself, because it takes your stomach some serious time to adjust to it, and it's really an unpleasant experience. You will get the worst gas of your entire life. So it's a great plant, it has its uses, but as a human food I find it marginal. A final temperate climate survival crop that you probably have never heard of is Dioscorea batatas, which is also known as the Chinese yam. It's listed as an invasive species in some states at this point, and that means it grows really easily. You can find it online by looking up cinnamon vine. It has tiny little bulbils, which are aerial roots. It's a climbing vine, has little aerial roots that are like pea size, like little chickpeas, and those are edible. You can cook them with butter. Eric Toensmeyer, author of Perennial Vegetables, calls them yam berries, and you can cook them and eat them. And they also make a very nice large root beneath the ground, which is carbohydrate rich and is very easy to grow. I grew them in North Florida, which is kind of towards the bottom of their range, but you can grow them up into Massachusetts and elsewhere. They take a good amount of cold. They will come back, and year after year they'll grow from the ground, and after 2 or 3 years they make a lot of little roots on the vines. You can actually leave the big root in the ground, harvest the little roots off the vines, and eat those. But be aware that it is on some invasive species lists. If you're lucky enough to live in a tropical climate, I would also add cassava, dasheen, taro, and I would definitely put in African yams. Those aren't your sweet potatoes, those are those great big freaky looking roots like Dioscorea alata, Dioscorea cayennensis. If you look up this family, these are staple crops in Africa, South America, through the Caribbean, Central America. Very popular. They're also known as name roots in some places, and they come in white, yellow, purple varieties, and they make gigantic roots which are very good and calorie rich. They're like a gigantic Idaho potato. Some of them are better than others. But if you can grow those, definitely grow them. They grow up into probably the bottom of Georgia. But if you're any further north than there, you're probably going to have to skip those yams and grow sweet potatoes or white potatoes instead. But if you have the option, grow those. And cassava is another good option, which is a perennial in the tropics. You break the sticks off, stick them in the ground, and you get the roots. But those things are almost all pure carbohydrates and are not as nutritious for you as some of the other crops on this list. Another thing I want to cover, since we're talking about staple crops, remember, if you're living on these things, you are probably not getting the nutrition you should get. There are places such as Africa where people have plenty of calories from something like cassava, but they still deal with malnutrition because they are not getting a balance. This has happened in the South as well. There's a disease called pellagra, which happens when you eat primarily corn that has not been nixtamalized, which means treated with lime to bring out all the nutrition in it, and it's a niacin deficiency. So if you are living on staple crops that are mostly carbohydrates, they may not be particularly rich, I recommend that you grow other mineral-rich things to eat, things such as berries and kale, broccoli, cabbage, nice orange carrots or purple carrots, or things that are bright colored and healthy for you because they will balance out the fact that you're eating a lot of carbs. And also, just living on carbs is obviously not the best for you, so if you can work animals in, if you can get some chickens for eggs and meat, or some rabbits, or you could do some hunting, that is very helpful because you're going to want that protein and fat to keep moving along and to feel good and to feel healthy. So they may be a staple crop like, rice in China, but if you saute that rice with a bunch of vegetables and some strips of meat, it's going to be a lot better for you than if you just lived on rice. You may survive on rice, but living on it long term is not particularly good for you. Thanks for watching. I'm David the Good, and until next time, may your thumbs always be green.
This is Lou from Prepper Advantage, and today I'm going to teach you how to make a very simple one-match fire.
Only one match.
One match!
Only one match.
I can't get any closer to the fire.
Okay.
And I want you to watch how the flame is going to go up, right?